The Nexith came from the darkness between galaxies where no light had ever reached and no probe had ever traveled. And they came hungry in numbers that made the greatest fleets of the Concord look like scattered grains of sand on an endless beach. The first warning came from a mining colony on the outer rim of civilized space. A small outpost of 3,000 Valkyrie workers who sent a single transmission before every communication channel went silent forever. Datosh. Transmission contained only 2 words repeated over and over in voices that grew more panicked with each repetition until they finally cut off with a horrible wet sound that would haunt the dreams of everyone who heard it. They are eating within 6 hours. The Concord's fastest scout ships arrived at the colony's coordinates and found nothing but debris, floating in the void where a thriving settlement had once stood. And the debris was not made of metal or stone or any building material that made sense. The debris was bone and flesh and organs that had been chewed and discarded by something that did not waste time with the parts it did not find tasty. The Nexith were a locust species that had consumed 17 entire civilizations before the Concord even knew they existed. And they did not negotiate or enslave or conquer in any traditional sense of those words. They simply fed. Their billions of chitinous forms could blot out the light of a sun as they moved from system to system, and each individual creature was roughly the size of a ground transport vehicle with mandibles that could slice through starship armor like a hot knife through soft butter. They had no culture and no art and no ambitions beyond the next meal. And they communicated through a hive mind that made them act as one organism spread across 1,000,000 bodies that felt no fear and knew no mercy. The Concord's military response was swift and confident and ultimately catastrophic in its failure. The Krethnak sent their legendary First Fleet to intercept the swarm at a defensive position in the Korath Nebula. 200 warships crewed by the finest warriors their species had ever produced. And they were absolutely certain that their superior technology and their impenetrable armor would carry the day. The battle lasted 4 hours. When it was over, the Krethnak First Fleet had been reduced to drifting hulks, being picked clean by Nexith feeders. And the few survivors who managed to escape in damaged shuttles could only babble about teeth and claws and the sounds of their comrades screaming as they were devoured alive. Elorians attempted to use their psychic abilities to disrupt the Nexith hive mind, sending their most powerful telepaths to project waves of mental energy that would have reduced any normal enemy to drooling helplessness. But the Nexith hive mind was not normal. It was too vast and too alien and too empty of anything resembling individual consciousness. And the Elorian telepaths who tried to touch it found their own minds shattered by the contact with something that experienced the death of 1,000,000 individual bodies as meaninglessly as a human might experience losing a single hair. The Gorvathi held defensive lines on a dozen worlds with their usual stubborn courage, planting their massive feet and refusing to retreat, even as the swarm washed over them like a tsunami of chitin and hunger. They held those lines until they simply ran out of bodies to hold them. Within 18 months, the Concord lost 42 worlds to the Nexith advance, and the refugee fleets fleeing from those worlds clogged every shipping lane and jump gate in civilized space with desperate beings who had nowhere left to go. Great powers of the Concord began to blame each other for the failures, and the alliance that had held together for 2,000 years started to crack under the weight of mutual accusations and bitter recriminations. Emergency sessions of the Grand Council devolved into shouting matches where ambassadors accused each other of cowardice and incompetence. And no one could agree on a strategy because every strategy they tried had already failed. Throughout all of this chaos, the human delegations watched. They attended every emergency session and took careful notes without offering any opinions or suggestions. They recorded every tactical briefing and every battle report with their ever-present curiosity that no one found remarkable anymore, and they sent everything home to Earth. on encrypted channels that passed through relay stations that the Concorde had never thought worth monitoring back on Earth. The old men and women with their scars and their haunted eyes reviewed every piece of information their children sent them, and they began to make preparations that had been planned for decades in facilities that officially did not exist when the Nexith Vanguard finally entered the Sol system and began approaching the small blue world that had seemed so harmless from a distance. Humanity dropped the mask they had been wearing for 15 years. Earth sent a single transmission to the Concorde on every communication frequency simultaneously, and the message was short enough that it needed no translation. We have handled worse before, and we will handle this now, so send your survivors to the following coordinates and stay out of our way because we will take it. From here, the Concorde's military commanders laughed when they received this message because the idea that the soft, harmless humans could succeed where the greatest warriors in the galaxy had failed seemed like the desperate joke of a doomed species. But then the first human warships emerged from hidden hangars and began moving toward the Nexith Vanguard. And the laughter died in every throat that had produced it because those ships were not crewed by the young smiling diplomats and healers that the galaxy had come to know over the past 15 years. Those ships were crewed by something else entirely, something old and scarred and patient, something that had been waiting for this moment since before the first alien probe had ever scanned Earth's skies. Something that the galaxy had never bothered to look for because they had been too busy underestimating everything humanity had ever shown them. The wolves had finally decided to stop pretending to be sheep. The first human warships to engage the Nexith swarm were crewed almost entirely by men and women who had lived more than 60 years on their violent little world, and the Velkari observer assigned to document the battle could not understand why humanity would make such a strange decision. Her name was Kathlira, and she was only 40 years old by her species count, which made her young and healthy and at the peak of her physical abilities. And she had been trained to analyze military engagements with cold objectivity that never let emotion cloud her judgment. But as she watched the human fleet move into attack formation, she felt something she had never experienced before during any of her previous assignments. She felt confused. Why would any species send their elderly into combat when younger and faster and stronger warriors were available to fight in their place? She asked herself as she reviewed the personnel files that the humans had reluctantly provided upon request. The ship commanders were in their 60s and 70s and even 80s, with gray hair and wrinkled faces and bodies that showed clear signs of past injuries that should have retired them from any kind of active duty decades ago. Many of them were missing limbs that had been replaced with mechanical substitutes, and many more carried scars on their faces and hands that told stories of violence that Kathlira could not begin to imagine. She assumed at first that this was some kind of desperate sacrifice, a last gesture of defiance by a doomed species that was sending its oldest members to die so that its younger members might have a few more hours to flee. Then she watched the battle unfold, and she realized how wrong she had been about everything. The human commander leading the assault was a woman named Sarah Chun, who was 73 years old and had burned scars covering half of her face from something called a fuel depot explosion during something called the Kandahar Offensive. And her left arm was a mechanical replacement that she had received after the original was destroyed by something called an improvised explosive device commander. Chum directed her fleet with a cold and methodical precision that Kathlira had never witnessed in any military engagement before. There was no panic in her voice when the first Nexus swarm intercepted her forward squadrons. There was no hesitation in her orders when casualty reports started flooding in from ships that were being torn apart by mandibles designed to crack open asteroids. When a Nexith boarding party breached the hull of her flagship and began pouring into the lower decks with their claws and their hunger, Commander Chen simply ordered those decks sealed and vented to space without any change in her vocal tone. She continued issuing tactical orders while her crew fought the surviving Nexus hand-to-hand in the corridors behind her bridge. And the sounds of combat and screaming and chitinous bodies being torn apart by weapons fire did not seem to affect her concentration at all. But Lyra watched a 73-year-old woman calmly coordinate a fleet battle while monsters were literally being killed 30 meters from her command chair. And she finally began to understand what the galaxy had failed to see about humanity. These old scarred humans were what Earth called veterans. They were men and women who had spent their entire lives fighting wars against each other on their death world. Wars over resources and territory, an ideology and religion, and 100 other things that seemed trivial from a galactic perspective, but had produced rivers of blood on Earth's surface. They had fought in jungles where the heat could kill you. Before any enemy had a chance to try, they had fought in deserts where the sand could strip flesh from bone during the storms that came without warning. They had fought in frozen mountains where a single mistake meant freezing to death overnight. They had fought in cities reduced to rubble by bombing campaigns that lasted years without pause. They had survived chemical attacks and nuclear threats and biological weapons that made the Elorian poison glands look like mild irritants by comparison. They had watched friends die screaming in their arms, and they had kept fighting because stopping meant dying. They had been broken by trauma and rebuilt themselves through sheer stubborn will, and then broken again and rebuilt again until their minds had become something that could process horror without flinching. And now, for the first time in human history, they had found an enemy that every single one of them could agree deserved complete destruction without any possibility of mercy or negotiation. The Nexus did not know what to make of prey that refused to flee when their ships were damaged. The Nexus did not understand enemies who accelerated toward death rather than away from it. The Nexus had never encountered a species that had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of killing things bigger and stronger and more numerous than themselves within 6 hours of first contact. The human fleet had destroyed 40% of the Nexus vanguard at a cost that would have been considered catastrophic by any other military in the galaxy. But the surviving human ships did not retreat to lick their wounds and mourn their dead. They regrouped and pressed forward into the swarm with weapons blazing and crews cheering and old men and women laughing at death the way they had been laughing at death since they were young soldiers on a world that had never known a single decade of true peace. Commander Chun was still issuing orders when reinforcements began arriving from Earth. Fresh ships crewed by fresh veterans who had been waiting their entire retired lives for one last fight that actually meant something. The jump gates opened again and again, and each time more human warships emerged with names painted on their hulls that told stories of old Earth conflicts that had never been shared with the Concord ships. Named Thermopylae and Stalingrad and Chosin and Kisan and Fallujah and 100 other places where humans had learned that survival required becoming something harder than the world trying to kill them. The Nexus had believed they were the ultimate predators in a universe full of prey. They had never met a species that had spent its entire existence being both predator and prey simultaneously. They had never met humanity's wolves. The Galactic Concord had watched Earth for 30 years before they decided to make contact with its inhabitants. And in all that time, they had reached a single conclusion about the strange bipedal creatures who called themselves humans. They were utterly unremarkable. Ambassador Velkith of the Velkari Dominion had personally overseen the observation reports, and she remembered laughing at some of the early findings with her colleagues during their evening meals together in the observation station orbiting the outer planets of the human system. The humans had no natural armor protecting their soft pink and brown bodies from harm. Unlike the Krethnak, whose scaled hides could deflect plasma fire without breaking a sweat, and unlike the Gorvathi, whose massive frames could survive the vacuum of space for nearly an hour without any protection at all. The humans had no venomous glands or poison sacs hidden within their flesh. Unlike the Elorians, whose mere touch could paralyze most carbon-based life forms within seconds of contact. And they had no electromagnetic perception that would allow them to sense danger before it arrived at their doorstep. They were small and fragile and soft. And the Concord scientists who studied them could not understand how they had ever become the dominant species on their planet in the first place. Their homeworld was classified as a death world of the highest order, a place where the gravity was crushing and the weather was violent, and nearly 70% of the surface was covered in water that could drown them, and the remaining land was filled with predators that could tear them apart with ease. And yet somehow these soft little creatures had survived it all. The scientists assumed it was luck, or perhaps some quirk of evolution, that had allowed them to slip through the cracks while bigger and stronger species fell to extinction around them. And they noted in their reports that humanity posed no threat to the Concorde and could safely be contacted without any military escort. When the Concorde finally extended an invitation for humanity to join their great alliance of over 200 spacefaring species, they assigned the newcomers to the lowest administrative tier that existed in their hierarchy. Tier 7 was reserved for species deemed useful but not important, species that could handle clerical work and agricultural development, and perhaps entertainment if they proved creative enough, but species that would never sit on the military council or have any real say in how the galaxy was governed. The Valkyrie ambassador who delivered this news to the human delegation did so with barely concealed amusement playing across her facial features, her long antennae twitching with what any experienced diplomat would recognize as condescension. And she expected the humans to protest or argue, or at least show some sign of wounded pride at being placed so low on the cosmic ladder. Instead, they smiled and nodded and thanked her for the opportunity to serve the Concorde in whatever capacity was deemed appropriate. Ambassador Velkith remembered feeling almost disappointed by their response, because she had prepared several devastating rebuttals in case they tried to argue for a higher position. But the humans simply accepted their place without a single word of complaint and got to work doing exactly what they were told to do. For 15 years, humanity played their assigned role with perfect obedience. They staffed medical stations across a dozen sectors, and the Concorde discovered that humans had a strange talent for healing that went beyond mere technical skill, because they actually seemed to care about their patients in a way that made recovery times shorter and survival rates higher. They served as translators and diplomats between species that had been enemies for centuries, and somehow their presence in negotiations led to more treaties being signed and fewer wars being started than anyone had expected. They asked endless questions about everything and everyone, always curious and always watching and always taking notes that they transmitted back to Earth on regular schedule that no one bothered to monitor, because who cared what they soft little humans were doing anyway? The Concorde's true military species barely noticed humanity at all. The Krethnak, with their impenetrable armor and their warrior traditions stretching back 10,000 years, considered humans beneath their notice entirely, fit only to clean their barracks and prepare their meals and perhaps provide some amusement during the long voyages between battlefields. The Elorians, with their powerful psychic abilities and their elegant ships that seemed to dance through space like living creatures, view humans as one might view a pet, something cute and harmless that could be patted on the head and forgotten about immediately afterward. The Gorvathi, with their massive bodies and their strength that could bend starship hulls with their bare hands, simply walked past humans in the corridors without even registering their presence, because something so small could not possibly be worth paying attention to, and humanity continued to smile and nod and serve and watch now. One in the Concorde thought to ask why humanity had sent only their youngest representatives to the stars. Fresh-faced men and women in their 20s and 30s who had never known hardship and whose eyes held nothing but hope and curiosity now. One wondered why these representatives were all diplomats and doctors and scientists and artists, with not a single soldier or warrior among them, despite the fact that human history was supposedly filled with violence and conflict. No one questioned why Earth itself remained closed to all visitors, why the human government politely but firmly refused every request to allow alien observers to visit their homeworld and see how the general population lived. No one asked where the old humans were, the ones with gray hair and weathered faces and eyes that had seen things worth remembering. No one wondered where the scarred ones were hiding. The Concorde had made their assessment, and they were satisfied with it. And they filed humanity away in the category of soft and harmless and useful, and promptly forgot to think about them any further. This would prove to be the greatest mistake in the history of their civilization, because while the young humans smiled and served aboard medical stations and diplomatic vessels, something very different was happening back on Earth in hidden shipyards carved into asteroids that no one thought worth monitoring. Massive warships were being constructed according to designs that had never been submitted for Concorde approval in weapons laboratories buried deep beneath mountain ranges that appeared uninhabited on every scan. Technologies were being developed that would make the Concorde's most advanced military hardware look like children's toys. And in retirement homes and veterans' hospitals and quiet houses on every continent, old men and women with scarred bodies and haunted eyes were watching the news from space with growing interest. They had sent their children and grandchildren to the stars to learn and observe and make friends, but they themselves had stayed behind, and they were waiting for the moment when the galaxy would finally need what only they could provide. Ambassador Keth Voran of the Elorian Dominion was one of the most powerful telepaths his species had ever produced, and he had spent his entire career reading the minds of other beings as easily as a child might read letters on a page. He had probed the thoughts of Krethnak warriors and found nothing but simple aggression and loyalty to their clan structures. He had touched the consciousness of Gorvathi generals and discovered straightforward tactical thinking wrapped around a core of stubborn pride that refused to consider retreat. He had never encountered a mind that he could not understand within seconds of contact. 3 weeks into the human counteroffensive against the Nexith, he requested permission to visit the command vessel of the human fleet so that he could better understand these strange allies who had appeared from nowhere to save a galaxy that had dismissed them as harmless. The human admiralty granted his request with what seemed like reluctance, that they allowed him to board the UN's Remembrance and observe their operations from a respectful distance. A Kethavern lasted exactly 4 minutes aboard the ship before he collapsed to the deck and began screaming. The problem was not that he could not read human minds, because he could read them perfectly well. The problem was what he found inside them. The moment he opened his telepathic senses to the crew around him, he was overwhelmed by a flood of memories that hit his consciousness like a physical blow. And he saw things that no Elorian had ever imagined any sentient being could survive. He saw cities burning under bombing campaigns that lasted for years. He saw children holding weapons they barely knew how to use while enemy soldiers advanced through the rubble of their homes. He saw mass graves being filled with bodies, while survivors watched with hollow eyes. He saw friends dying slowly from wounds that could not be treated because the medical supplies had run out. Weeks ago, he saw families separated by wars that lasted generations. He saw torture and starvation and disease and violence that seemed to have no end and no purpose beyond simple cruelty. And the most horrifying part was that every single human aboard the ship carried these kinds of memories, not because they had experienced these things personally, but because their parents had experienced them, and their grandparents had experienced them, and their great-grandparents had experienced them going back hundreds and thousands of years, into a past that was soaked in blood. The humans did not consider these memories to be unusual or noteworthy, because to them, this was simply what being human meant. A young doctor named Maria Santos was the one who found Keth Varn curled on the deck, and she was very gentle as she helped him to the medical bay and treated him for what she calmly described as psychic feedback. She did not understand why he was weeping, because the things he had glimpsed in the minds around him were just history to her. Just background noise, just the ordinary price of being born into a species that had never stopped fighting itself. You have survived so much, Keth Varn managed to say through his tears as Maria checked his vital signs and made notes on her medical tablet. Maria looked at him with genuine confusion on her young face, and she asked him what he meant by that question. Everything, Keth Varn replied while his telepathic senses were still reeling from what he had experienced. All that pain and death and suffering that I saw in the minds of your crew. How can you carry such weight and still function as normal beings? Maria considered this question for a moment, and then she shrugged her shoulders in that casual way humans had when they did not consider something particularly important. We learn to carry it, she said simply, and then we use it to make sure our children have to carry a little bit less later that day. Keth Varn was granted an audience with Captain James Okonkwo, who commanded the Remembrance and who had personally fought in 4 separate wars before his 30th birthday. According to his personnel file, Okonkwo was an old man now with gray hair and dark skin marked by scars that told stories Keth Varn did not want to read directly from his mind, and his eyes held a weight that seemed far too heavy for any single being to carry. How do you do it? Keth Varn asked him directly because he needed to understand these impossible creatures who had emerged from nowhere to save the galaxy do what exactly? Okonkwo asked in return. Continue, Keth Varn clarified. After everything your species has done to itself and everything you have personally witnessed and survived, how do you find the will to keep going forward? Okonkwo thought about this question for a long time before he answered, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and steady. We do not forget, he explained. That is not how humans work, because we cannot simply erase the bad memories and pretend they never happened. So instead, we learn to carry them the way you might carry a heavy pack on a long march, and eventually the weight becomes something we barely notice anymore. He gestured at the tactical display behind him, where human fleets were systematically destroying Nexus positions that had held against the Concorde's finest warriors for months. Everything we have done to each other becomes experience, he continued. Pattern recognition and survival instincts and knowledge about how to endure when enduring seems impossible. My grandfather survived a genocide, and my mother survived a famine, and I survived things I will not describe to you now. And each generation passes down what it learned to the next, so that they might survive even worse. He smiled at Keth Varn, and the expression held no warmth at all. The Nexus thought they were the ultimate predators, but they have never met a species that domesticated wolves and rode horses into battle and turned the atom itself into a weapon. Okonkwo said quietly, we did not become the dominant species on a death world by being gentle or forgiving or kind to our enemies. Keth Varn left the Remembrance with a new understanding of humanity that he would spend years trying to explain to his fellow Elorians. The humans were not warriors despite their trauma. They were warriors because of it. The Nexus War ended 19 months after humanity entered the conflict, and it did not end with a peace treaty or a negotiated surrender or any of the diplomatic solutions that the Concorde had been hoping for. Since the beginning, it ended with extermination. The beep. Human veterans who had emerged from their hidden retirement to save the galaxy did not believe in leaving enemies alive to threaten future generations. And they hunted the Nexus swarm to the last hive ship with a methodical patience that terrified even their allies. Every breeding ground was located and sterilized. Every queen was tracked down and killed. Every egg cluster was found and destroyed before it could hatch the Concords. Military advisors suggested several times that perhaps enough was enough and the remaining Nexus could be contained rather than eliminated. But the human commanders simply ignored these suggestions and continued their systematic campaign until nothing remained. When it was finally over and the last Nexus signal had gone silent forever, the Galactic Concord convened an emergency session to discuss what they had witnessed and what it meant for the future. The debate about humanity's new classification lasted 6 hours and generated more heated argument than any session in recent memory. Some ambassadors wanted to classify humans as a dangerous species that should be monitored and contained before they could turn their terrible abilities against the Concord itself. Others argued that humanity had proven themselves the most valuable allies in galactic history and should be rewarded with full membership and military integration. A few simply wanted to pretend the whole thing had never happened and go back to treating humans as the harmless clerks and healers they had seemed to be. Debate was finally interrupted when Ambassador Sarah Chun rose from her seat in the human delegation and asked permission to address the assembly. She was 75 years old now, and her scars were more visible than ever, and her mechanical arm had been replaced with a more advanced model that had been gifted to her by grateful Krethnak engineers who had finally learned to respect the soft little beings they had once dismissed. She spoke softly and without any prepared notes, and every being in the chamber fell silent to hear what she had to say. You classified us as harmless because we sent you our healers and our diplomats and our dreamers. She began while looking around at the assembled representatives of 100 different species. You saw us smile, and you assumed we had no teeth, and that was our gift to you. She paused to let her words sink in before continuing. 15 years of peace. She said, 15 years of believing that the universe was gentler than it actually is. That was what we gave you by hiding what we really area. Young Velkari delegate in the back of the chamber raised her antennae and asked the question that everyone was thinking. Why did you hide it from us? She demanded to know, why did you not warn us about the Nexus when you knew they were coming? And why did you not show us your true strength from the beginning? Chun smiled at the young ambassador, and the expression held genuine warmth mixed with something ancient and sad. Because we hoped we were wrong about the universe. She answered honestly, our astronomers spotted the Nexus decades ago, and we knew they would eventually reach civilized space. But we hoped that maybe we were being paranoid, the way we have always been paranoid about threats that might never come. She straightened her posture, and for a moment, every being in the fawn chamber could see the steel that lay beneath her grandmother exterior. We sent our kindest representatives to the stars because we wanted to be kind. She continued. We wanted to learn from species that had never known world wars or genocides or the constant fear of nuclear annihilation. We wanted to believe that our bloody history was an aberration and not a survival trait. She gestured at the empty space above the council chamber where holographic displays usually showed tactical information during military briefings. But we never forgot what we are, she said firmly. We never stopped preparing for the day when the darkness would come again. And when that day arrived, we answered with everything our bloody history had taught us. The Concord voted unanimously to elevate humanity to Tier 1 status with full military integration rights and permanent seats on every council that mattered, but more importantly than any political designation, they updated their official files on the human species. The new entry read as follows: species, human homeworld, Earth. Classified as Death World Category 7, primary classification, Apex Predator. Social Variant Threat Assessment, extreme diplomatic status, ally. Approach with caution and respect, and in smaller text at the bottom of the file, added by a Velkari analyst named Kef Lira, who had watched the entire war unfold from beginning to end. There was a personal note that would be read by every diplomat and military officer who accessed the human files for generations to come. They are not harmless. The note read, they are simply patient. They choose gentleness the way a warrior chooses to sheathe a sword. Deliberately and always with the faith with the battery and with deliberately and always with deliberately and always with the vice. Knowledge that it can be drawn again whenever the need arises. Do not mistake their kindness for weakness, and do not mistake their scars for vulnerability, because the humans remember everything, and they have survived everything, and they will continue to survive long after the stars themselves grow cold there. Scars are not marks of damage, but marks of victory. Proof that they faced something terrible and emerged from it alive and stronger than before. Read them with respect, because they have earned it in blood, and most of that blood was their own.